But thank you all for being here tonight. We're studying the theme, Trust God in These Uncertain Times. And the lesson tonight is based on the book of Habakkuk, a short book in which the lesson is this: God's providence puzzles his prophet. The prophet of God was puzzled by the message of God. Wicked King Jehoiakim was reigning in Judah about 600 BC. When God spoke to Habakkuk about the condition of Judah, the prophet truly was puzzled. Now, as the book begins, the prophet is puzzled because it seems God is tolerating the wickedness of Judah. Why would God do that? Why doesn't God do something about it? Well, God said, I'm going to do something about it. I'm going to bring Babylon to punish Judah. This knocked the prophet off his stool again. He said, you're going to do what? Why, Babylon is more wicked than we are. How can you use Babylon to punish us? The prophet was puzzled by the message of God. Now, God was actually teaching this lesson, that in the end, God punishes all the wicked. He will do this in his own time, in his own way. And this is where we have to learn to trust in the Lord and wait on the Lord, as we studied this morning. Notice Habakkuk 2 and verse 4 now. There's a contrast between the arrogant and the just, the wicked and the righteous. Referring to the king of Babylon, behold, his soul, which is lifted up in him, or which is lifted up, is not upright in him. King of Babylon's arrogant and evil. But the just shall live by his faith. That's the contrast the writer made. We're going to study about this by reading this short book. The eyes of the prophet were opened by the message that he received, and his faith was strengthened, and the questions were clarified that had been on his heart. You'll see in the end, in the last chapter, he prays for God's mercy as God will pour out his judgments upon the wicked. It is also a prayer of joy and faith and praise. You're going to see a great contrast in chapter 1 and chapter 3. The prophet has learned and he's grown, and that's what we also want to do. Above all, the prophet learned a greater trust in the providence of God over the nations of men, but he accepted the reality that we will never understand all the ways of God. And this is the great lesson that we want to take home tonight. Now, before I even start, I want to say that I know it is true that you, as well as myself, grieve over our nation's sins. The prophet is going to start by expressing his grief for his nation. We grieve over our nation, where violence reigns. And just for one example, since 1973, when the Supreme Court made abortion legal throughout the nation, we have murdered in this United States of America over 62 million babies, infants, innocent people in the wombs of the mothers. There are no words to express how angry God would be at such conduct. Our nation is in deep trouble. We can think about the immorality that is rampant in our nation. Beginning especially in the 1950s, divorce became easier and easier, so that people can just now abandon their wife, abandon their children, move on to another marriage, then later another marriage, then later another marriage, and it's perfectly acceptable. After that, what happened? Well, then we arrived at the wonderful conclusion that homosexuality is moral and ethical, and therefore people should be able to marry two males or two females. Was that the end of the story? Not the end of the story. Now we have the agenda that you don't really know if you're a male or a female. In fact, you might want to change. In fact, you might want to be a male one day, a female the next day, a male the next day, a female the next day. Who knows? Is that the end of it? Not the end of it. There was a time when there were organizations trying to promote the homosexual agenda. but they've already made it across the goal line. Did you know there are formal organizations now that promote adults having sex with children? There are. There are. Did you know that there are college professors openly advocating having sex with animals in the United States of America? There are. The immorality is out of control. I'm only saying these things to help you when we start into this chapter. And the prophet expresses his terrible grief at what's happening in his nation. You can relate to this man. You can relate to his message. Think of the corruption that is rampant. Corruption in the business world. People make these under-the-table deals all the time. Embezzlement, cheating, lying to promote products. Corruption in the political world, of course, is seemingly always rampant. And so we live in a culture of corruption, and we grieve for our nation. And so we could go on talking about that. The sins of our nation are without number, but they're known to God. And the prophet here was greatly troubled. Does God not see what's happening? What in the world is God going to do about this, and when? And we too wonder. But you know, in the end of this, all we can do is serve God and trust his providence. We can't right the wrongs in this world. God rules in justice and also mercy, and God rules with a purpose to save as many as possible out of this lost world. He knows what he's doing, and we need to trust in him and do what he teaches us to do. So let's go straight now to chapter 1, and let's see what the prophet said. He begins with a bitter complaint, but God will answer him. In verses 1 through 11. Habakkuk 1, 1 to 4. Why does God tolerate the sins of Judah? Does God not see what's happening? The burden which Habakkuk the prophet did see. O Lord, how long shall I cry, and thou wilt not hear? Even cry out unto thee of violence, and thou wilt not save. It seems God's doing nothing. Why dost thou show me iniquity, and cause me to behold grievance? For spoiling, in other words, plundering and taking, and violence are before me. And there are that rise up strife and contention. Are you not thinking, are the wheels not turning in your head? What's going on in our country right now? Strife and contention, rioting and looting? Therefore the law is slacked. The law isn't being enforced, and judgment doth never go forth. For the wicked doth compass about the righteous. Therefore wrong judgment proceedeth. Injustice reigns where justice is supposed to be. The prophet is burdened. All right, God will answer. In verses 5 to 11, he's going to use Babylon to punish Judah. God says through the prophet, Behold ye among the heathen and regard and wonder marvelously. It means you're going to be shocked at my answer. I will work a work in your days which you will not believe, though it be told you. For lo, I raise up the Chaldeans, that's Babylon, that bitter or ruthless and hasty nation, which shall march through the breadth of the land to possess the dwelling places that are not theirs. You're going to be overrun by a heathen nation. That's the answer. Babylon is going to punish you. They are terrible and dreadful. He's describing their military power. Their judgment and their dignity shall proceed of themselves. In other words, they set their own standard. They do what they want to do, right or wrong. Their horses also are swifter than the leopards, and are more fierce than the evening wolves. Their horsemen shall spread themselves. Their horsemen shall come from far. They shall fly as eagles that hasteth to eat. Well, today we might think of an invasion with maybe airplanes or something that moves fast. But he's describing the chariots that move fast, the armies that march fast, and they're going to strike you in a way that you cannot resist. They shall come all for violence. Their faces or their hordes shall sup up as the east wind, so it's like a storm that will hit you. They shall gather the captivity as the sand. Did you ever walk on the sand shore, on the seashore, and pick up a handful of sand? So he says they're going to march through here and just take what they want, and you won't be able to resist. They shall scoff at the kings, The princes shall be a scorn unto them. They're not afraid of your leaders. They shall deride every stronghold. They shall heap dust and take it. I'll show you a picture of heaping dust, but it's just referring to these siege ramps that they will build at your wall. Then shall his mind change, but a better translation, they sweep past like the wind, and he shall pass over and defend, imputing this his power unto his God. So they will claim that their idol gods gave them the power to do this. All right, now Babylon. Babylon, of course, was in Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the Fertile Crescent, we call it. And it was a very powerful nation that rose up, and it swept throughout the world of that time, reaching as far as Egypt, over into modern Turkey, up into the edge of Europe, and so very powerful. Here's a stone etching of those soldiers. Today we might think of tanks or other modern weapons. In those times, the most fearful thing was chariot riders who were archers who could fire a bow about as fast as you could shoot a gun and with as much accuracy. So think of hundreds of these coming and the arrows being shot. The siege ramp, it talked about gathering up dust or dirt or rocks. So you have the great fortifications. You would think nobody could take this city. Well, what they did is build these great mounds against the wall and construct these, I don't know what you call it, a siege, just a siege machine on top of the mounds. And they would then begin to undermine the wall and then shoot with their weapons over the wall and finally break through the wall. And so the point is, there's no stopping these people. You can make the best fortifications in the world, but you're not going to be able to stop them. All right, God has answered the prophet. Is the prophet going to be happy and satisfied that he got the answer? No, sir. He's going to complain again. And he says, I'll wait to hear what next. How in the world can a holy God use an unholy Babylon? The prophet is puzzled by that. All right, verse 12. Art thou not from everlasting, O Lord my God, mine Holy One? We shall not die. Surely you're not going to wipe us off the face of the map. O Lord, thou hast ordained them for judgment. And he's scratching his head when he says that. Almighty God, thou hast established them for correction, and I have no clue why you would do that. Thou art of purer eyes than to behold evil, and canst not look on iniquity. Wherefore lookest thou upon them that deal treacherously, and holdest thy tongue when the wicked, watch this part, when the wicked devoureth the man that is more righteous than he. Now the prophet has already admitted that Judah is wicked. But now he's thinking of Babylon. They worship idols, while they're worse than we are. How can a righteous God use a people that are worse than we are to punish us? He's puzzled. He's puzzled more than he was at the first. Again, describing the power of Babylon, and makest men as fishers of the sea, as the creeping things that have no ruler over them. Think how a fisherman drops his nets and just takes up the fish, and they have no choice in the matter. They take up all of them with the angle. They catch them in their net. They gather them in their drag. Therefore they rejoice and are glad. Therefore they sacrifice unto their net. The idea would be boasting of their power, and burn incense unto their drag, because by them their portion is fat, they're succeeding, their meat is plenteous. Shall they therefore empty their net, and not spare continually to slay the nations? God, now I don't understand why you would let people like Babylon just scoop up one nation after another nation like a fisherman with his net. What kind of God would do that? All right. Now chapter 2, verse 1, actually the break should have been after chapter 2, verse 1. I will stand upon my watch and set me upon the tower, and will watch to see what he will say unto me, and what I shall answer when I am reproved. So the prophet has presented his complaint. Now he said, I'm like a watchman who stands on the tower waiting for a messenger to come and bring me the answer. All right, so that's the setting now for this book. Let's go into chapter 2, beginning at verse 2. God will punish wicked Babylon. Now think what has just happened. The prophet has protested to God, do you not know how wicked Babylon is? Does God know how wicked Babylon is? He's informing God. All right? And so God's going to inform him. I know more than you know how wicked Babylon is, and I know when to punish Babylon and how to do it. Habakkuk must write God's answer into Judah's heart. God is going to answer, and it's your job to write this answer into the hearts of the people. Look at verses 2 and 3 now. The Lord answered me and said, write the vision and make it plain upon tables, that he, this would be in the contextual sense, a message is being sent by a great king. You have a herald who scatters the message through the land. So he is the herald, may run that readeth it. So it's just saying this. Culturally, they would have immediately connected the dots. If there's a great announcement today, the media comes together and it goes out through our media. In those times, there's a great announcement from the king. He sends these runners, these messengers. All right? So write the vision, make it so plain that the heralds can take this and run throughout the land, for the vision is yet for an appointed time. God has something in mind to do. But at the end, it shall speak and not lie. The vision that I'm going to tell you about is going to come to pass. Now, though it tarry, what was our subject this morning? Wait on the Lord. Same lesson. We're dealing with national affairs now. But wait on the Lord. Wait for it. Because it will surely come. It will not tarry. So it's the job of Habakkuk to spread this message through the nation. And God's going to show him that Babylon will fall. But it's on God's timetable and not on Habakkuk's timetable. And he's got to learn to trust God in that regard. Now the rest of this chapter is going to show a review of some of the sins of Babylon. The prophet has expressed the sins of Judah, and he said, what's God going to do about it? And God said, well, I'm going to bring Babylon. Well, why would you do that? Don't you know how wicked they are? So here it is. How wicked are they? The pride of Babylon versus the faith of God's people. Beginning in verse 4, behold, his soul, the king of Babylon, which is lifted up, is not upright in him. Now when you go to the next line, the just, in contrast, the one who is not upright. God knows the difference, but the just shall live by his faith. God is teaching his people, you put your faith in me. This morning we emphasized impersonal issues that come before us in life. But now we're thinking national issues that come before us in life. What is the character of our nation? What is the destiny of our nation? Who is ruling in our nation? You can think of some of these political upheavals. You can think about the rioting, the looting. You can think about the pandemic. There are a lot of national issues on the table. The just shall live by his faith. Now faith. Faith. At that time, the point about the faith would have been trusting that God is ruling Israel, but also ruling the other nations of the earth, such as Babylon. And what that faith encompasses is knowing that God rules the nations in a way that will lead to the Messiah coming into this world. That's the plan, and that's the purpose, and they should have that faith. All right, the sins of Babylon. He's going to pronounce woes on wicked Babylon in verses 5 to 20. First, Babylon is a nation built on greedy plunder, and God knows that well. Verse 5, yea, also because he transgresseth by wine, he is a proud man, neither keepeth at home, who enlargeth his desire as hell, the King James says. The word hell there is Sheol, the same as Hades in Greek. It's talking about the realm of death. The realm of death is never satisfied. The king of Babylon was never satisfied, all right, and is as death and cannot be satisfied, but gathereth unto him all nations and heapeth unto him all people. So in other words, this king is going to destroy many nations, plunder many nations, because of greedy plunder. That's his plan, that's his character. Shall not all these take up a parable against him, and a taunting proverb against him, and say, Woe to him that increaseth that which is not his? How long would God tolerate that? And to him that ladeth himself with the clay. Shall they not rise up suddenly that shall bite thee? What goes around comes around. God is saying, you have taken plunder, well, others will plunder you. And awake that shall vex thee, and thou shalt be booties for them, or unto them, because thou hast spoiled many nations, all the remnant of the people shall spoil thee, because of men's blood, and for the violence of the land, of the city, and of all that dwell therein. So, the king of Babylon has built a great nation. How? Plundering other people. What's the end result of such a policy? God will bring the plunder to Babylon. You will face the same fate. Babylon will reap what it has sown. It has built itself on violent destruction of others, and it will fall in the same fashion. In God's time, in God's way. All right, verses 9 to 11. Another woe, because they built their political power by evil gain. Woe to him that coveteth an evil covetousness to his house. So again, his spirit is never satisfied. He just wants more and more, and he doesn't care how he takes it. That he may set his nest on high, that he may be delivered from the power of evil. Thou hast consulted shame to thy house by cutting off, by plundering many people, and hast sinned against thy soul. For the stones shall cry out of the wall, and the beam out of the timber shall answer it. Now, those are figurative expressions, but there is an underlying literal fact. We're told from history, kings like the king of Babylon would conquer people, burn their bones, mix it in the mortar, and especially in the throne room. This room is built on the bones of my enemies. I'll show you what a great king I am. But look what the Lord said. The wall will cry out against you. So what he's saying, there's a price to pay. There's a price to pay when you do this. Babylon built its empire by unjust gain, by exploiting and destroying and plundering others, and its plundered possessions cry out against Babylon. God rules the nations, folks. We need to trust him. Verses 12 to 14. Their economic power had been built on blood labor. Woe unto him that buildeth a town with blood, and establisheth a city by iniquity. Behold, it is not of the Lord of hosts that the people shall labor. Let me back up. I misread that. Behold, is it not of the Lord of hosts that the people shall labor in the very fire, and the people shall weary themselves for very vanity? What he's saying is, you have succeeded on blood labor, building your great empire, and it's all going up in fire and smoke. It cannot last. It cannot stand. For the earth shall be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. The fall of Babylon will echo through the nations. And that's how men will see that God is reigning this universe. So Babylon's palaces and cities that were built with slave labor and stolen wealth, it will all go up in smoke. God rules the nations. It makes us wonder, what is in store for our nation? We don't know the answer to that, but we know that God rules the nations. All right, verses 15 to 17. Wicked Babylon was intoxicated on power and was passing the cup of its violence and its power to conquered nations. Woe unto him that giveth his neighbor drink, but now this is figuratively speaking, and puttest thy bottle to him, and makest him drunken also, that thou mayest look on their nakedness. Here's the figure. I have a neighbor, and I covet what he has. So I'm going to give my neighbor alcohol to drink. When he drinks the alcohol, he passes out. Now I can plunder, I can rape, I can do whatever I want to do. All right, that's what they've done to nations. Thou art filled with shame for glory. The things you glory in are shameful. Drink thou also, and let thy foreskin be uncovered. The cup is coming back to you. The cup of the Lord's right hand shall be turned unto thee, and shameful spewing, that's the vomiting of the drunk, shall be on thy glory. For the violence of Lebanon, they've been violent in attacking Lebanon, which was also near Judah. The violence of Lebanon shall cover thee, and the spoil of the beast, which made them afraid. They had slaughtered the beasts, and they had cut the trees from Babylon and just utterly destroyed it because of men's blood and for the violence of the land, of the city, and of all that dwell therein. God saw what Babylon had done, and God was going to answer it. Babylon stripped and raped her neighbors. Now Babylon in time will drink out of that same cup. That's the answer of God. Now then, another woe. They were seeking the help of their idols and boasting of the power of their idols in the time of God's judgment, and they will fail. What profiteth the graven image, that the maker thereof hath graven it, the molten image and a teacher of lies, that the maker of his work trusteth therein to make dumb idols? Woe unto him that saith to the wood, Awake, and to the dumb stone, Arise, it shall teach. Behold, it is laid over with gold and silver, and there is no breath at all in the midst of it. Now God is pronouncing woe because Babylon turned their backs on God and made these idols. They carved them with their own hands, they painted them with their own hands, and then they bowed down and said, Save me. Listen, our God is a different God. The Lord is in his holy temple. No man carved the true God out of a piece of wood. Let all the earth keep silence before him. When God speaks to destroy a nation, that nation will fall. And the idols can do nothing. The people are deceived in Babylon. So does God know what's going on in Babylon? He does. And God knows those idols of Babylon are but nothing. Let all the earth bow before the great Jehovah who rules this universe. All right, so that's the answer to the prophet. Now, chapter 3, you're going to see a shift of gears. The prophet has learned his lesson. Habakkuk prays with renewed faith. First, a prayer for mercy, because God has told him there's a terrible destruction coming upon Babylon. A prayer of Habakkuk the prophet unto Shigionoth, and that's some kind of musical notation because this prayer was later used as a song. O Lord, I have heard thy speech and was afraid. O Lord, revive thy work in the midst of the years. Now revive thy work. So something, he's thinking of the past. Think how God's power had been seen in Israel in the past history of Israel. Revive thy work in the midst of the years. In the midst of the years make known. In wrath remember mercy. So first, Lord, why would you use Babylon to punish us? And when God gets through saying, these are the sins of Babylon, and a terrible destiny is awaiting Babylon, the prophet's attitude has changed. Lord, when you judge Babylon, even judging those people remember mercy as well. God always saves his people. And that's going to be what you have here in verses 3 to 15. Now this is highly poetic. The very first verse we read disturbs even some Christians who will ask about this. But if you will just understand, this is poetic language. Don't make it as literal. You won't have a problem. God came from Teman. Teman is south of Judah. And the Holy One from Mount Paran, Selah. Selah is a Hebrew term indicating a pause. So maybe it's a pause to think what's been said. So let me just pause to say this. Where did the Jews meet God in the sense that he gave his law? Where did that happen? Mount Sinai? All right. That's what it's reminding them of. Another name of Mount Sinai is Mount Paran, and that is Teman to the south of Judah. The reason this has disturbed some people, they said, I thought God is from everlasting, and it says God came from Teman. But in a poetic way, it's saying, this is when God met you and gave his law to you. All right? His glory covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise. Remember how the mountain was quaking, and there was lightning, and all of those events? His brightness was as the light. He had horns. The King James says horns. That's not a good translation. That should be rays. It's rays of light with brightness. All right. Rays coming out of his hand. There was the hiding of his power. Before him went the pestilence, and burning coals went forth at his feet. This is expressing God's power over the natural realm. Remember the 10 plagues of Egypt? That shows his power. Crossing the Red Sea, destroying the army of the Pharaoh, shows his power. The rays of his brightness were shining. So here on the map, you've got Judah up here, Jerusalem. Come down to the south. It said Teman to the south. Coming down to Mount Sinai. This is where they met the Lord. That's what the prophet is talking about. God's mighty power was manifested on the behalf of Israel at that Mount Sinai in the wilderness, and then in the conquest as they went into the land of Canaan. All right? So the prophet is going to continue describing that in poetic language. He stood and measured the earth. What does that mean? It means he rules over it. He beheld and drove asunder the nations. He defeated Egypt. He defeated the Canaanites. The everlasting mountains were scattered, and the perpetual hills did bow. His ways are everlasting. All things bow to God. I saw the tents of Cushan in affliction, and the curtains of the land of Midian did tremble. It means when they crossed that Red Sea, the message and the news of God's horrible destruction of Egypt went ahead of Israel, and their enemies were shaking in their tents. All right? That's the power of God. Was the Lord displeased against the rivers? This is poetic. He split open the Jordan River, remember? He split open the Red Sea. Was thine anger against the rivers, and thy wrath against the sea, that thou didst ride upon thine horses and thy chariots of salvation? All right? So God just passed through the Red Sea and passed across the Jordan River, the chariots of salvation. Thy bow was made quite naked. So God is like a warrior shooting the bow, according to the oaths of the tribes. But again, the better translation, the arrows, even thy word. Selah, pause. God's word was being fulfilled by shaking the mountains and shaking the nations. God is a great warrior. His arrows strike his enemies down to the earth. Thou didst cleave the earth with rivers. The mountains saw thee, and they trembled. The overflowing of the water passed by. The deep uttereth his voice, and lifted up his hands on high. Poetic description again of opening the Red Sea. The great power of God. All right, pause a minute. Think what we're reading. Nations bow to God. Nature bows to God. God is the great warrior king. God is the great warrior king. And he always saves his people. Verse 11, the sun and the moon stood still in their habitation. Now this is poetic, but was there a time that literally the sun stood still? Anybody happen to remember that in the conquest? Yeah. Nature serves God. The light of thine arrows, at the light of thine arrows they went, and at the shining of thy glittering spear. Thou didst march through the land in indignation. Thou didst thresh the heathen in anger. Now, we don't have threshing anymore, but they used to harvest grains and then beat the grains to separate the hull from the grain. So God is threshing the nations. He threshed Egypt and Midian and the Canaanites. All right? Thou wentest forth for the salvation of thy people, even for salvation with thine anointed. Thou woundest the head out of the house of the wicked, by discovering the foundation unto the neck, Selah. Thou didst strike through with his staves, or spears, the head of his villages. They came out as a whirlwind to scatter me. Their rejoicing was as to devour the poor secretly. The enemies of God's people rose up against them. But thou walkest through the sea with thine horses through the heap of the great waters. So again, referring to the opening of the Red Sea. That was the great display of God's power. All right, he's showing that God brought destruction on those who would have destroyed his people. The Pharaoh's stubbornness did not destroy God's purpose or God's people. The Pharaoh destroyed himself, not the people of God. God defeats the enemies of his people in his own time, in his own way, and by his own power. Now here is how it all ends. Total trust in God. The prophet has risen to the occasion. In verses 16 to 19, when I heard, my belly trembled. My lips quivered at the voice. Rottenness entered into my bones, and I trembled in myself, that I might rest in the day of trouble. The NIV says on that part of it, I will patiently wait for the day of calamity. Rest, patiently wait. The day of trouble is the day of calamity. He's acknowledging that God will destroy Babylon in his own time, in his own way. When he cometh up unto the people, he will invade them with his troops. So now he's remembering the great power of God, and he trembles to think about it. He's awaiting for the day of Babylon's destruction. What has happened to the prophet? The just shall live by his faith. He's no longer complaining against God, but he's living by faith. Although the fig tree shall not blossom, neither shall fruit be in the vines, the labor of the olive shall fail, the field shall yield no meat, the flock shall be cut off from the fold, and there shall be no herd in the stalls. Now pause a minute and think about this. This was an agricultural society and economy. He has just described the collapse of the economy. If you want to make that like our time, in this pandemic with this lockdown, we've nearly had a collapse of our economy. And so what are we going to do when that happens? Are we just frantic? We're going to run around like the chicken with his head cut off? Look what the prophet said. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in the God of my salvation. The Lord is my strength, and he will make my feet like hinds' feet, like a deer who escapes the hunter. He will make me to walk upon mine high places. The deer goes all the way to the mountaintop, and the hunter can't pursue him anymore. And then again, because they use this in worship, to the chief singer on my stringed instruments. But it's a beautiful conclusion. He starts complaining, and he ends praising the power and the providence of God. So he puzzled over God's providence. Why would God tolerate the wickedness of Judah? Do we sometimes wonder? I'm just going to admit I do. When and how is God going to bring justice to the United States of America with all of our sins? I don't know the answer any more than Habakkuk did as you start out the book. And then why can God use Babylon to punish Judah? We don't have prophets today. If we did have a prophet, we might be just like Habakkuk if God were to say, well, here's how I'm going to make the United States pay for her sins. We might say, you're going to what? You're going to use China? Why, those people don't even know you are God. At least the United States knows you're God. You're going to use North Korea, that little petty dictator? You're going to use a pandemic and make even the Christians suffer? I don't know how God will answer, but do you see my point? We would be just as puzzled as Habakkuk was if we knew how God was going to do certain things. We don't know. It's better that we don't know. We don't need to know, but we need to learn the lesson that's in this book. God will punish the wicked, and that includes our nation. When and how? In His own time, in His own way. Behold, His soul which is lifted up, those who are the arrogant, is not upright in Him, but the just shall live by his faith. Trust in God that His promises are true, and He has made prophecies, multiple prophecies, that Christ will someday return and we have a home in heaven. And those promises are true. Habakkuk's eyes have been opened and his faith strengthened. And as I study this book, it helps to open my eyes and strengthen my faith. He then prayed for God's mercy in the time of judgment. But he prayed in joy, faith, and praise. And that's what we need to do. Let's learn what he learned. Let's learn a greater trust in God's providence, and let's admit and acknowledge what he also learned. We will not know the ways of God. It's beyond us. We're just creatures on the earth. He is the great God. As the prophet said, the Lord is in His holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before Him. God is ruling as He always has, in His own time, in His own way. Wait for Him. Chapter 2, verse 3. He rules perfectly to fulfill His purpose. It will surely come. He was referring to Babylon. But let's just apply that to all the promises of God. They will surely come to pass. Nothing will fail. We trust God when we do not understand the ways of God. The just shall live, not by understanding all the ways of God, but the just shall live by his faith. We can learn that same lesson. God rules in justice and He rules in mercy. And why is He ruling? At Habakkuk's time, he was ruling to bring the Messiah. In our time, He's ruling in justice and mercy to save a lost world. Romans 1:16, for I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For therein refers back to the gospel. The gospel message is the righteousness of God revealed from faith. The basis of our salvation is in our faith. From faith to faith, as it is written, and look who he quoted. Habakkuk. The just shall live by faith. Folks, it's teaching us to have the same faith that Habakkuk had to learn in his time. In the gospel age, we live by that same faith. We are to be the same people of faith. Faith in God, His promises, and His purpose. He rules to save a lost world, And that's why Mark 16, 15, and 16, he sent the apostles out to proclaim the gospel to this lost world. Go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. And that's what God wants done today. People in Fairbanks, Alaska need to hear the gospel. And most of them don't even know they need to hear the gospel. But you know, and I know, and we need to work toward this end. He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved, but he that believeth not shall be damned. There's only one Savior. There's only one hope of salvation. The people who are lost do not know that. And we need to take that message to them in every way that we can. Have you obeyed the gospel? Are you living by faith? Faith when it comes to your personal trials? Faith when it comes to these greater national issues? We need to be a people of faith. And that starts by obeying the gospel. And then you live the life of faith until we leave this world. And when we obey the gospel, we must be steadfast to the end. How many thousands upon thousands have been baptized and not faithful to the end? There won't be any salvation if we do that. Let's make up our minds. The just shall live by his faith. We're going to be that people of faith to the end. And then the promises of God will not fail us. Heaven is prepared. A prepared place for a prepared people. And let's prepare to go to heaven. Should there be any Christians present who need to correct sin in their lives, we're ready to help you. If you will come forward and confess those things and put them away, we can pray together tonight, and the blood of Christ will make you clean. But if you've never been baptized into Christ, you need to take that first step and begin your journey to live by faith. And we're inviting you to come tonight while we stand now and sing this song, Will You Come?